This lecture looks at Western Europe and what happens after the fall of the Roman Empire, with the rise of those barbarian peoples, as they were known, that would come to dominate the era, looking particularly, first off, at the Hiberno Saxons and the Vikings. With the fall of Rome and its sack by Alaric and the Visigoths in 410 Common Era, we do know that the Emperor and the Pope were safe in Ravenna, the Byzantine stronghold that we will discuss in the Byzantine section. The barbarians, however, were going to be those individuals who could only barble Greek or Latin, the classical languages that defined civilization as the Roman Empire saw it. Now, exactly who these peoples were is going to vary greatly, given that we do not have a historical record for many of them. We do know that they are outside of Rome's orbit, those that are beyond the borders, say, of Hadrian's Wall or of Germania or the Danube, for instance. These are going to be tribes that are going to be organized by families in this tight-knit social organization that is highly nomadic. Now, when Rome falls, we see a massive migration into Europe of these peoples. The wooden architecture that they built and that they lived in is now lost. However, the metalwork and animal geometric ornamentation that they so loved survives, such as the torques we discussed on the dying Gaul and the jewelry that the Gauls wore. To show what happens after the fall of the Roman Empire from 500 to 1000 Common Era, we have these various barbarians flooding into Western Europe, taking hold of territories once controlled by Rome, now splintered into dozens and dozens of smaller principalities and factions, yet at the same time fusing with the Greco-Roman heritage with these northern peoples. We note that the Visigoths, who sacked Rome, will settle in Spain and convert to Christianity. The Burgundians are going to settle in Switzerland and eastern France, giving Burgundy its name. The Franks are going to settle in Germany, France, and Belgium, eventually giving France its name. And the Vandals are going to make their way all the way to North Africa. These groups would, as the Roman Empire had, slowly convert to Christianity, and we find that in the early Middle Ages, where there is a lack of political unity, the Church will act as a unifier among the populations that spread out in Western Europe, what is now the UK and North Africa. The Frankish king Clovis I, the founder of the Merovingian dynasty, will be one of the first great examples of this conversion, since he is going to form an alliance with the popes that will last throughout the Middle Ages and all the way into the modern era. This arrangement is going to find kings and nobles that are under the king defending the claims of the Roman Church and that the Pope is the true arbiter of God's message on earth. And in turn, the Pope would validate the authority of the kings, hence the divine right of kings. At this time, we find that the Church will be the principal patron of the arts, and so we find their style will be influenced by these quote-unquote barbarian peoples that are going to convert to Christianity, but are going to then present a Christian message with it. For an introduction to the style that these northern peoples preferred, we turn to Scandinavia and Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, where we have several surviving brooches and other decorative elements. Here, with the Gummersmark brooch, we find from Denmark in the 6th century, a small, just under 6-inch high brooch, a decorative element illustrating what we mean by the animal style. Now, the animal style is going to have abstract patterning with animal motifs, specifically serpents, beasts, and squat humans. Along the upper section here, you also see another geometric abstract pattern known as the eye and beak motif. That's going to show that birds will peck out the eyes of victims left on the battlefield. Hence, we have, of course, these tribal associations that value warfare and warriors. In the central section, we find that men will be compressed by dragons. Hence, the northern interest will be carried on when we discuss Vikings here shortly, for the love of dragons and serpents. Turning to what we discussed in Islam, we should note that there is an interest that is common among all of these northern peoples in surface ornamentation and abstraction. So as with Islam, we are not going to be moving beyond the surface. It takes quite a while for Western illusionistic classical perspective to seek its way back into the canon of Christian art. The symmetrical compositions are going to be common in both cultures, where we find animals will be shown in profile or from above, strictly speaking, as we saw going back to cave painting. Turning to the style and its introduction to the Hiberno Saxon area, now we should note that Hiberno Saxon or Anglo-Saxon both refer to the cultures of the English Isles between the 6th to the 10th century Common Era. The Irish and English islands are going to be given the nickname Hibernia, that is Ireland, by the Romans. Hence we have Hiberno for Hibernia or Ireland, and Saxon for the Saxons who lived there, and ethnic peoples. The Anglo-Saxons and, once again, others will find their way from Germany, while the Utes are going to come from Denmark, settling in southeastern Britain, the main population center in this island. Most of the items created by the Hiberno Saxons will be small and portable status symbols. They can be found primarily in burial mounds. The best surviving one is going to be found at Sutton Hoo. The burial mound here at Sutton Hoo should remind one of the Cairn Hills or graves we looked at in the Neolithic period from the early prehistoric period in the UK. Now, the Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf, written between the 8th and 11th centuries, is going to tell us that heroes would be cremated along with, quote, buried rings and brooches in the barrow, all of those ornaments that brave men had brought out from the hoard after Beowulf died, end quote. There is a tradition, hence, in the Anglo-Saxon peoples and era to bury their dead along with the jewelries and status symbols associated with them. Here we have in Beowulf and at Sutton Hoo, the description matching up with the ship that was found along with this burial cache or hoard. Now we know that, according to Beowulf, the warrior lord Scyld is going to be laid to rest in a ship and set adrift with treasures and ornaments, as the epic poem states. Among these are 40 gold coins found at Sutton Hoo, paid to 40 oarsmen to help them cross over a body of water, which is very common in most of these civilizations as we discussed. The Greeks and the Romans believed that you needed to cross over the river Styx by way of Charon to get to Hades. We know the Egyptians would cross over the Nile in order to get to the afterlife. Hence, we have several traditions that carry on this understanding, and it is included here in the Anglo-Saxon. Now we have 2 silver spoons inscribed Salos and Palos, also converting and or suggesting this could be the Anglican king Redvald who converted to Christianity, because the biblical story of Saul, who is going to be converted to the Apostle Paul, is going to be a commonly cited example for Christian converts in this era. Now we know that there is even a Byzantine silver bowl found among the items at Sutton Hoo, showing that, like the Vikings after them, the Anglo-Saxons or Hiberno-Saxons are going to trade with far distant civilizations. The items found at Sutton Hoo vary, but can be generally discussed as illustrating the animal style. They are small, and generally the only parts that survive are those metalwork or jewelry aspects. Here, with a hinged clasp of roughly 5 inches in length, we have abstract animal designs. In the millefiore technique, or 1,000 flowers from the Italian, we have it decorated with colored pieces of glass cut into geometric shapes and stylized into these animal forms. Among them, we note that we have blue, red, and black being the primary colors used. The clasp would have been for a leather body armor that would have been worn by the Anglo-Saxons, as seen in many recreations of this myth. So you would hold together the leather armor from the front to the back with these different hinge sections. Much like we discussed with the fibula that go back to the ancient Near East and Greece. If we look at a detail of the hinged clasp, we can see that we have overlapping bores and interlaced snakes. So we find that the snakes will be interlaced, biting each other's tails. That is a motif that carries on around this rectangular section or frame. In addition, we find that the overlapping bores represent strength or bravery for these peoples. So you can see their snouts below as their haunches make their way to the outer rim or sides of this given brooch. Just like the Gummersmark brooch, we find here with the hinge clasp from Sutton Hoo an interest in surface decoration, abstraction, geometric ornamentation, and animals. These motifs will be carried on in the earliest examples of Christianity and its art in the Isles, and we find that they survive here in the Celtic North and West in monasteries as centers of art and learning even after the collapse or fall of the Roman Empire. Now, the monasteries were also isolated and undefended and easy victims for Viking attacks. But while the Vikings stole from and looted these monasteries, they also brought their love for abstract animal patterns or this animal style to the British Isles. In these monasteries, we have scriptoria, or writing studios, where illuminated manuscripts would be created by monks, copying books by hand. The only way information was preserved and carried on, passed down generation to generation. These books often took the form of ceremonial objects carried by deacons in processions, as we saw in many mosaics and illustrations earlier, such as the Justinian mosaic at Ravenna. We find that Christ often will also be shown holding a jewel-encrusted book that would have been hand-copied, illuminated, and illustrated. As one of these, we find an example here with the Book of Duro, where the Gospels are going to begin with a carpet page of pure embellishment, and also include portraits of the authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The books are generally not made with parchment and/or with paper, but instead on vellum or calfskin, making it incredibly durable. Here we have the symbol of Matthew, which is a winged man, which opens the ancestry of Christ. The figure here is going to be frontally posed with his face, hair parted equally in the middle, with his feet in profile. We find that the cloak that he wears is going to flatten out his figure and show us the same interest in abstraction we looked at earlier. The animal style abstraction that we saw with the Gummersmark brooch and Sutton Hoo can be seen here in the intertwining patterns around St. Matthew, as well as the flat millefiore-like technique used to illustrate his body with the checkered pattern of yellow and red and green. One of the most famous examples of this animal style by way of book illumination comes with the Book of Kells. In the Kiroyota, the page here of pure embellishment, which is going to very elegantly outline and detail the first letters of Christ's name in Greek, roughly looking like the English equivalent XPI, often overlapping. We find here at the base in Latin, it begins with the Latin phrase Christi autem generatio, and or the verse from Matthew 1:18, now the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, took place in this way. Hence, of course, beginning the promise of salvation and resurrection. The bottom here, we have highlighted that Latin phrase for clarity. Now, this is not a picture of the actual event of Christ's birth like a nativity scene, but instead pure ornamental celebration, a jubilant celebration of the promise of the Messiah, carried out in that animal abstract style. Now, the Kyroiota is not new. Coming from Greek, this is going to be inspired by not only the Greek Gospels, but the Greek Orthodox religion, where we often find the Kyroiota or XPI overlapping, such as seen here in the shield of Justinian's soldiers. Now, the idea of having an embellishment for a religious work is not new and is not unique to Christianity in the North. As we discussed in Islamic culture, we find that Qurans are very often going to be embellished with similar geometric ornamentation and or arabesque whiplash-like designs. The animal style here that is going to be used to illustrate this Christian subject actually is nothing Christian at all about the ornament. It is taken almost entirely from earlier pagan and or barbaric, if we were to use the vernacular of the day, civilizations. So we find that these animal forms are going to be taken because they are appreciated by a recently converted population in the north. In another one of these carpet pages in the Lindisfarne Gospels, this in Northumbria in England for St. Cuthbert, we have on the Lindisfarne Island an excellent example here of a cross-inscribed carpet page. Painted on vellum, we find that the rhythmic intertwining of these motifs is held in check by the stability of this Irish or Celtic cross in the center. This stabilizes the patterns, the rhythmic patterns of overlapping serpents. Just as we had seen earlier at Sutton Hoo, the overlapping and interlocking serpentine motif will be dominant and is a popular motif in the north, not only from Scandinavia, but in the Hiberno Saxon era as well. This is modeled on, in fact, reliquary crosses, which are the largest sculptures at the time in existence in the north. The design is going to then be transferred by way of metalworking in this animal style as well, where we find that it is a Christian symbol, but it is illustrated in that rather pagan approach or style. Just as the interlocking and overlapping snakes illustrate on the Sutton Hoo clasp. Another type of illumination, which is common in these illuminated manuscripts, is that of an author portrait, or a portrait of the author whom we are about to read, such as the four Gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John most commonly. In this particular example, we again have St. Matthew. Now, the model for this Lindisfarne Gospel is actually going to be taken from a classicizing book in Italy. Hence, we have many classical motifs here included. The figure of Matthew, as we see here modeled on these Roman-style books, is going to be seated and dressed as a Roman philosopher with long hair, wearing a toga and sandals, in, once again, this illusionistic space with a curtain being pulled back. As a Greek and Roman-seated philosopher or poet, this is commonly understood as the Gospel writers, since they are also very educated and important writers and authors in this classical term and tradition. In turn, the classical motifs which are included here can be seen in the curtain, which is setting the scene indoors. The seat is at an angle, hence suggesting a type of intuitive perspective being used. It is labeled both in Greek and Latin, the most prestigious classical languages at the time, and, of course, Greek is what the New Testament would be written in, and Latin that of the Vulgate. Now, up above, we find that the symbol of St. Matthew is also included in the imago hominis, the image of man. So both the angel and the man are both present, indicating the presence of this gospel writer. Now again, we find that this is going to be still seen through the lens of the Hiberno Saxons, and so we are uninterested in volume. We find that the forms are conceived in terms of line and color. This linear idiom is going to carry through until we reach the Carolingian Renaissance. Turning our attention back to Scandinavia, we have the main Viking routes opening up in 792 to 870, and we find that they will spread their culture throughout Western and Eastern Europe, making their way all the way to the Americas. Their name coming from Viken, or the people from the coves. We know that the French are going to find them so bothersome, they buy them off by giving them a section of northern France, still called Normandy to this day, for Northmen. Now, they sent out flotillas of up to 350 ships across Europe and the Atlantic through the 9th and 10th centuries, sailing nearly 200 miles a day. We know, famously, that Leif Erikson reached North America in the year 1000, well ahead of Christopher Columbus and his exploits. The ships with which the Vikings sailed the seas are often decorated with sleek sea serpents. They are used for burials and journeys, especially passages to Valhalla, used to hasten the journey to the afterlife. Here at Oslo, we have the Osberg ship, which was looted and is 75 feet long, but it was originally for 2 women, a queen and her companion, along with 12 horses, dogs, and an ox. Even though the hoard was looted, the ship remains intact and gives us a good indication as to how the Vikings make a very shallow draft in a ship that is both seaworthy and capable of sailing up shallow rivers. The same carries on from that earlier burial ship that we looked at from Sutton Hoo, showing that the same cultures were communicating and sharing technological innovations and ideas. The prow of the ship is going to spiral into a serpent's head. The bands of interlacing animals surrounding it, including dragons, carry on that interest in the animal style that so dominated the era before, such as what we looked at with the Gummismark brooch. The Danish king Harald Bluetooth is going to order that many stones be placed near a smaller rune stone to celebrate the fact that he had Christianized the Danes. When these peoples of the north, the Vikings, become Christian, they adopt or use many of their same interests and integrate Christian symbolism and iconography into them. In this instance, we have a rune stone which was commissioned for inscriptions. An early version of the Germanic alphabet can be seen to the left, while a picture stone would be commissioned in order to illustrate the significance of the rune stone, this one having figural decoration. On the inscription, we hear that, at 8 feet tall, King Harald had this memorial made for Gorm, his father, and Thyra, his mother, one for himself, all Denmark and Norway, and made the Danes Christians. Hence we are celebrating as a standard stele motif going back to the ancient Middle East, that something has happened. There is an event this is recording, and that is the Christianization of this area in Denmark. This new style that accompanies it in the picture stone is going to combine the interlacing foliage and ribbons along with animals that were appropriate and were popular in the north. Here we have a stone that was originally brightly polychromed, showing us Christ, who is in a crucifixion pose, with ribbons that are going to be wound around him, much like serpents that are intertwined, biting one another. Christ here is robed, in fact, in a Byzantine manner, showing the connections that the Vikings had with Byzantium and Eastern Orthodox Christianity. His arms are outstretched and entangled and double-ribboned, interlaced, in this instance, instead of nailed to a cross. Hence, as with many cultures, we first celebrate Christianity for its promise of renewed life. And so whether it be in Africa, Central or South America, or in this case in Scandinavia, local inhabitants that convert to Christianity prefer to be reminded of the promise of life, not death. Here is another version of it that was repainted, illustrating it more clearly, with the figure of Christ, his arms outstretched, eyes open, the promise of eternal life, that you will live forever. Now, the interlacing ribbons should remind one of the interlacing dragon and serpent motifs that were found on the ships. Therefore, the style is still going to be of a pre-Christian era and is one of a traditional Scandinavian one, not of the classical Christian tradition. Turning to the imagery, we know that these individuals in the north would have had contact with the Byzantine Christians for the iconic presentation, and the imagery chosen is going to be much more closely associated with the Byzantine culture. Finally, when considering Christian architecture in churches in the north, we see that they still incorporate northern decorative motifs and engineering technology. Here we find that Scandinavia becomes officially Christian in 1015, so most of the churches are built thereafter. The types of churches are telling because they are known as stave churches, named for the 4 huge timbers or staves that support a central roof. We can, of course, tell what the climate is and the rate of precipitation annually when looking at the roofs of these various structures. For if there is low precipitation annually, the roof will be relatively flat. The more snow and rain there is, the sharper the elevation and the cantilevering is of the roof. Looking in the center, we note that these churches are very tall, but quite narrow, only being able to hold a very small parish or village. The staves can be seen in the massive timbers holding it up on each side. We still have the same terminology used in these churches, however, for we still have a nave, where we're standing right now, side aisles off to the sides here with benches for people to sit, and still a high altar and a pulpit, all still carrying on this very traditional Christian basilica imagery. However, on the exterior, we have something that is uniquely Scandinavian. On the gables, there are in fact dragon heads with crosses to protect the church and the congregation from trolls and other demons that were believed to lurk in the mountains and the woods. Next time, we will continue on with the Carolingian and Ottonian Renaissance, when we see the revival and return to the classical tradition, a reestablishment of education, and a final view of monumental sculpture finally returning.